Welcome to the Three Down Breakdown CFL show as we look at Week 3 in the Canadian Football League. I'm Ian Cameron for Sportsbook Review. Andrew McInnes, my co-host, not available today, but I'm sure he'll be back next week. He did provide a best bet, though, for the Week 3 card, and I'll make sure to mention that later on during the program. Let's quickly look at a couple of headlines coming from Week 2 of the CFL season. Really, the headlines remain the fact that the underdogs continue to bite in a big way here so far in the Canadian Football League season of 2017. 8-0 against the spread in the CFL in the first 2 weeks. That is against the closing number. You could make the argument Saskatchewan opened an underdog, or sorry, Winnipeg rather opened an underdog against Saskatchewan, but Saskatchewan closing the favorite there. It ended up being a situation where against the closing line, it's the underdog cashed. In that case, Winnipeg, they were about 2.5 point underdog when that line closed, and able to get the victory against Saskatchewan. So against the closing number, underdogs in the CFL 8-0 against the spread so far. And another thing that's very interesting to me in watching the first 2 weeks of the CFL season, it's been the fact that we have seen, I think, in terms of secondary play, pass defense, it's been abysmal. It's been as bad as I've seen in a 2-week stretch in the Canadian Football League in quite some time. I mean, we are seeing some really poor play in the secondary. I mean, we're seeing cornerbacks get burned. We're seeing safeties get burned. We're seeing big plays being made in the passing game. You look at Ottawa, Calgary, I don't think either defense knew what the hell they were doing in the secondary in that football game. They were getting burned and torched time and time again in what was a absolutely wild shootout between the Stampeders and Red Blacks last week. You could say the same thing about Winnipeg and Saskatchewan on Saturday night. Neither of those two teams held up very well in the secondary, which has been pretty much a trend here in the league. Think about Hamilton in Week 1 against Toronto, how poor they were and how shredded they ended up being with their pass defense against Ricky Ray. So it has been a league-wide thing. I've noticed that the secondary play in this league has been poor. Now, obviously, it's a pass-heavy league. You give the quarterbacks probably the edge in terms of being able to throw the football and being able to do it with confidence and with success. But to see the players in the secondary struggle to the extent they have, that has been a little bit surprising to me, because we have seen good cornerback play at times in the CFL, especially, the last few years. We've seen some very good cornerbacks in this league, but we have not seen pass defense be very good for the most part across the board through the first 2 weeks of the CFL season. It's going to be interesting to see if maybe some of these teams, in terms of shoring things up on the back end, they're going to be able to do it moving forward. Let's begin with our Week 3 preview now as we get into it for this week. We've got 4 games on the slate starting on Thursday, July the 6th. We've got the BC Lions taking on the Montreal Alouettes. The Alouettes, 0-2, but very, very tough 0-2. They had a chance to win both of their first 2 football games against Edmonton and Saskatchewan. They're 1-1 rather. They beat Saskatchewan 17-16, losing to Edmonton 23-19 last week, but haven't really played all that well, even despite the 1-1 straight up record so far for this Montreal Alouettes team. They got outgained in both of those games, and I thought Darian Durant, the quarterback of this Alouettes team, a little bit last week against the Edmonton Eskimos. It's the second game now in this offense, a little bit more comfortable with Jacques Chapdelaine, the head coach and the offensive coordinator of this Montreal Alouettes team. There might be a little bit more rhythm in the Alouettes offense last week. We really didn't see it. I mean, we really didn't. I mean, other than Montreal capitalizing on a couple early first half fumbles by the Edmonton Eskimos, they didn't really move the football up and down the field very much against an Eskimos defense that I think is okay. But I think, in their past defense, it's another team that does have concerns in their secondary. Montreal just wasn't able to take advantage of it. Their defense hung in there for as long as they could, but you give Mike Riley and that Eskimos offense enough chances to make plays in a football game, they're going to do it. I mean, you're not going to be able to shut them down completely, especially at Commonwealth Stadium on their home field. And eventually the Montreal defense did give up the lead and allowed Edmonton to walk away with that victory, 23-19. Montreal did cover the number, though. 9-point underdog they opened. They closed right around that same number, 8.5, 9-point road underdog Montreal. They did cash for me last week. I did have a client release on Montreal in that football game, able to get the job done point spread wise, but could not get the straight up victory against the Eskimos in week 2. Now they return home to face the BC Lions, and there's an impact injury I need to mention here for this Montreal Alouettes team. And this is something that I think is worth mentioning in regards to the other footballs as well, NFL, college football. What injuries and what positions get the most attention in terms of injuries in football? It's very obvious to determine which ones those are. Quarterback, wide receiver, running back. It's your skill position talent. That is where all the headlines go. That is where all the attention is paid in terms of injuries in football. The skill position talent. People go crazy. The fantasy dorks, for fantasy football, they go crazy for a running back injury or a wide receiver injury or a quarterback injury. The mainstream talking heads on ESPN and all the American media outlets, they're going to go crazy about a quarterback going down to injury, a top receiver, a top running back, you name it. And all of those type of injuries at the skill positions get all the attention. But I think those injuries often, not always, obviously some quarterbacks are so good that when they get injured, it's a big deal. But I'm talking about the under the radar injuries, the ones that don't get even a quarter of the attention that an injury to a quarterback would, or an injury to a running back would, or an injury to a wide receiver would. I'm talking about injuries along the offensive line, the defensive line, a linebacker, or a key cog in a secondary. Those are impact injuries for a lot of teams, especially when you get cluster injuries in one particular group. Well, for the Montreal Alouettes, they lost I think a guy that's been fantastic for them in 2 weeks so far this season in the secondary, and Jonathan Mincy. You think about the fact that he saved a touchdown by a great pass breakup in the first game against Saskatchewan, played very well in that game, played very well last week, neutralizing some of those top Edmonton receivers for a very long time last week. We didn't see a Darius Bowman really get going. Brandon Zylstra didn't have the same kind of game catching the football that he did against BC in Edmonton's first game, and neither did Duke Williams. Jonathan Mincy played a large role in that for the Montreal Alouettes out of that secondary. Well, he's injured. He is likely out for this game Thursday night against BC, and he may not be back anytime soon. And if you watch the way the Montreal Alouettes have played here in 2 weeks, he's been hands down their best cornerback. It's not an issue. It's not even debatable. He has been the absolute best player, maybe on that entire Alouettes defense in the first couple weeks of the season against Edmonton and Saskatchewan. So they are going to miss him. And now we're looking at a situation where this team was already, I think, down 3 projected starters in the secondary going into that game against Edmonton. 3 guys that were expected to be in that back 7 already out, and now you have lost your best guy, Jonathan Mincy, the way he was playing. So this is a cluster injury situation right now for the Montreal Alouettes in the secondary. I don't know if they're getting any of those 3 projected starters that missed last week back yet. There's a potential, from the latest I've read, 1 of them, maybe 2 of them might return, but it's not a given yet. And even if 1 or 2 of them do return, they're now missing their best guy in that secondary in Mincy. So it's a big-time impact injury. It's something you're going to want to make note of going into this game here against the BC Lions on Thursday night. A BC team that's really, I don't know what it is about BC. This is a team that I had great hopes for going into the season. I thought they were a Grey Cup contender. I picked them to win the Grey Cup before the season began. And yes, they're 1-1. They bounced back with a nice win on the road against the Toronto Argonauts last weekend. And pulled away in the fourth quarter to do it. But I have not seen a consistent 60-minute strong 4-quarter performance yet from the BC Lions. I mean, they didn't play great against Edmonton at home in that loss. They took a ton of penalties. Jonathan Jennings wasn't sharp. The offensive line was abysmal. Couldn't pass protect, couldn't run block. And then last week against Toronto, they had the same issues on offense for 3 quarters in that football game. The first 3 quarters. Couldn't pass protect. Jonathan Jennings was missing his receivers. Couldn't really run the football with a great amount of success. And then finally in the fourth quarter, they finally started to put things together. They got a touchdown to take the lead, and then a key fumble by James Wilder, the Florida State Seminole, played there as a running back now with the Argonauts. He fumbled in the fourth quarter, and that allowed BC to take over and basically win that football game, or at least put it away with another touchdown and win 28-15. Only outgained Toronto by 49 yards, not like they dominated last week. We haven't seen that dominant effort yet from this BC Lions team. We're going to have to see if we get it here against the Montreal Alouettes here in this one. we've got the current line in this game's BC about 2.5-point road favorite. They opened 3.5. We've actually seen some early Montreal money, and look, the spot definitely. I mean, they're in a situation where they're off a loss. They're back home. They did win their previous home game against Saskatchewan. I understand that, but I won't be back in Montreal in this game. I think Montreal is a team I'd rather back on the road. They've actually been very, very good on the road. I believe they're now 5-0 against the spread, Montreal. Their last 5 road games going back to last season. The road is where I want my money on Montreal because you're getting more points with Montreal on the road. You're not getting that at home. And I don't like their home field advantage. It's not a strong home field advantage whatsoever. They're already 0-1 against the number at home this season. They beat Saskatchewan in week 1, 17-16, but they were 7-point chalk in that game. Didn't even come close to covering the number. BC still the better of these two teams. I know I haven't seen a full 4-quarter strong performance yet from BC, but now we're talking about 2.5, and we're talking about a decimated Montreal secondary. Even if they get a player or two back, it's been compounded, and then some by the fact now that Jonathan Mincy's down with an injury, their best cornerback. So I think Montreal's got some issues. Their offense has been very, very lackluster. Clearly, it's taking Darian Durant a little bit more time than people expected for him to gel with this new Alouettes offense. So at less than a field goal, I can only look to BC here, laying the points, laying the small price here as a road favorite. Calgary, Winnipeg, Friday, July 7. This should be a fun game because both of these offenses looked very good last week. Winnipeg with Matt Nichols, Calgary with Bo Levi Mitchell. Calgary opened a 3.5-point road favorite here. It's pretty much 3.5 still across the board, although showing signs that it might be trickling down a bit. Bookmaker Chris at -3 right now. So some Winnipeg money, a little bit of Winnipeg money has come in. Total at 56, pretty much across the board. Calgary, Ottawa was a fun game last week. I'm not sure there's anybody that watches the CFL that didn't think that was an entertaining football game. It was back and forth. Both defenses struggled mightily in that game. Calgary's not the same defense. I don't want to say that they're way down from last year on the defensive side of the football, but they're not nearly as good as they were last year on defense or the year before that. I mean, it's a Calgary team that so far through 2 games, they have shown some holes on the defensive side of the football, and they've shown them mostly in the secondary, which, as I said at the top of the show here today, it's been a problem league-wide. I mean, bad secondary play. You can put Calgary in that discussion. I mean, their secondaries look terrible at times, and this is a Calgary defense that led so many statistical categories last year in the CFL in terms of defense. They just haven't played at that level. So far here through 2 weeks. They gave up 31 points to Ottawa in week 1, faced Ottawa again last week, gave up 39 points, and to hang on for dear life to win that one, 43-39. So there's some issues right now with this Calgary defense. No question about that. They have not played as good as they have in the last couple of seasons. We'll see if they can get back on track here. Devon Claybrooks, the defensive coordinator for the Stampeders, not going to be very happy in terms of the way his defense has played so far. And it's funny because they've got Tommy Campbell, Seontae Evans. They've got pretty much a lot of the same people in that secondary. Jamar Wall. I mean, very much the same secondary they had last year. And to see them struggling, to this degree, I mean, look at this pass defense. It's 7th in the CFL. You're not used to seeing Calgary that low in terms of pass defense. 7th in the CFL, allowing over 360 passing yards per game. 8th in the CFL in total yards allowed so far. 461 yards per game being allowed through 2 games by this Calgary Stampeders defense. So that's definitely not something you're used to seeing. That's definitely a concern for me here with Calgary laying points on the road against a Winnipeg offense that showed last week against Saskatchewan that, obviously Matt Nichols being the quarterback of this Winnipeg team is what turned things around for the Blue Bombers last year. This was a team that struggled early in the season. Mike O'Shea makes them the call to go with Matt Nichols as the quarterback, put Drew Willie on the bench, and it really paid off and played out perfectly for Winnipeg because they got hot from that point. Nichols played well, and they ended up making the playoffs. And I was wondering if Nichols was going to be capable really of duplicating the success he had last year. And so far, albeit just one game, he was very, very good last week against the Saskatchewan Roughriders in that wild 43-40 shootout between those two teams. Nichols with very good numbers in that game for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, 23 of 36, 4 touchdowns, just 1 interception. I'm impressed with the amount of weapons he's got, too. Weston Dressler had a big game. Darvin Adams. Andrew Harris ran the football well. LaDamian Washington is a guy they have really high hopes for at receiver here for this Bombers team. So they have a ton of weapons, and it's going to be a challenge for this Calgary defense. We're going to find out this week, really, Friday night. Is Calgary's defense, was it just a matchup problem against Ottawa because they faced the same team 2 weeks in a row to start the season? Did they just struggle with that Ottawa offense? Or is this a case of maybe this defense is a little overrated? Maybe not quite as good as they've been in years past. We're going to find that out Friday night, because if they have similar struggles stopping Winnipeg the way they did against Ottawa, could be a clear indication at that point, at least to me, that the Calgary defense is just not quite what it's been over the last few years. So we'll see how that one plays out. Winnipeg gave Calgary fits last year. I can see why this line's kind of a little bit shorter. You look at the games last year head-to-head, especially the one in Calgary, 36-34. Calgary escapes with a win. There's no question about that. That was a very good performance by the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Prior to that, they played them in July. I believe Drew Willie was the quarterback in both of those games, though. 33-18 Calgary, 36-22 Calgary. It was that last game in September when Matt Nichols was the quarterback of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. He took over, and that's when the Winnipeg Blue Bombers gave Calgary their biggest test of those 3 head-to-head meetings last year. So I'll tell you what, Calgary's defense has not been anywhere close to what I was expecting. And when you've got a leaky defense going on the road laying 3.5 points, that's not exactly a profile I'm looking to endorse here. So I still think Calgary probably a little bit better team than Winnipeg, but I'm not sure I'll be laying the points here with them in this one. Let's go to Saturday now. We've got a doubleheader. We've got Toronto taking on Ottawa, Hamilton taking on Saskatchewan to wrap up week 3 in the Canadian Football League. We've got Ottawa, a 5.5-point home favorite against Toronto, total of 55.5, 56 in that range. We've got the Ottawa Red Blacks now finally playing a team other than Calgary. I mean, they played Calgary 3 times in a row, the Grey Cup last year, twice to start the regular season this year. Now they'll play this Toronto Argonauts team, and you got to worry about a little bit of an emotional, I don't want to say letdown, but you just played 2 big-time games against a team that you faced and you beat in the Grey Cup last year, facing them twice again to start this season. Now you're returning home off 2 intense, hard-fought football games. We'll see where the Ottawa Red Blacks are able to bring to the table here in this game against the Toronto Argonauts, a Toronto team that's really stunned the CFL world in week 1 with that 32-15 domination against the Hamilton Ticats. We were all of a sudden starting to think, okay, is this Jim Pop, Mark Trestman combo going to just unveil their magic right away and turn this team into a juggernaut right away? Well, reality set in for the Toronto Argonauts a little bit, at least, last week against BC. Actually, they were right in that game. In fact, they led after the 3rd quarter, but they just had a disastrous 4th quarter. I mean, BC moved the football at will against Toronto. They had that key fumble. The Argonauts in their own territory gave BC great field position, and they were able to put the game away with that 2nd touchdown, win that game 28-15. So Toronto drops to 1-1, a little bit more like the Toronto Argonauts I was expecting to see going into the season. But I will say this about Toronto. Impressive win against Hamilton, led BC after the 3rd quarter last week before the roof caved in a little bit. The effort, the attention to detail, they're not really beating themselves. They haven't taken a ton of penalties, the Argonauts, so far this season. They're well prepared for football games. Mark Trestman has already, in just 2 weeks, instilled preparation, discipline, and just being ready to play week in and week out for this Toronto Argonauts team. I mean, they didn't lose last week because, their preparation wasn't good. They didn't lose last week because their effort wasn't good or they weren't ready to play. And they did. They played well. But, they were beaten by a team with a little bit more talent. Let's be honest. BC's a team that is in the Grey Cup conversation this year. I'm not sure Toronto is. It's going to take Toronto still, I think, a little bit of time. A consistent playoff team, consistent Grey Cup contender, still going to take them a little bit of time. That being said, I'm concerned about the spot here for Ottawa. They tied Calgary in week 1 on this field at TD Place in Ottawa. lose to them last week 43-39. And now you return home against this Toronto Argonauts team, Toronto off their first loss of the season. And Ottawa, to me, laying significant points right now, I'm not sure I'm willing to jump at it. I've been impressed with Trevor Harris. He's played very well. I said there's not going to be an issue here for the Ottawa Red Blacks in terms of Henry Burris's retirement. They're still going to be able to get good quarterback play from Trevor Harris, assuming he can stay healthy. And he's played well through 2 weeks. But last week, the defense fell apart for Ottawa. They couldn't get stops when it mattered. They had some miscues as well. They had some special team snafus. They gave up a kick return touchdown. Bad special teams week for Ottawa. Gave up a kick return touchdown. A blocked punt as well took place, which really swung the momentum in Calgary's favor last week. So some things in the special teams they've got to clear up. Look, Toronto won week 1. They were right in the game against BC until the fourth quarter last week, a good BC team. I'd be reluctant to go against Toronto here in this kind of price range. I really would. I think it's going to be a tough situation here to lay these kind of points with Ottawa, coming off 2 intense games against a team you played 3 times in a row, including in the Grey Cup. So this is one favorite that could be in a little bit of trouble here when you look at it going into this game on Friday night. All right, we've got Hamilton and Saskatchewan to wrap up week number 3 of the CFL season. We've got the Saskatchewan Roughriders, about a 1.5 point favorite here in this football game against Hamilton. The total currently sitting at 52.5, 53 across the board. Hamilton off the bye, a chance to regroup a little bit, because the last time we saw Hamilton, I think most of our viewers will agree, if they watched that Hamilton-Toronto game, complete disaster. Complete shit show. It was awful football from the Hamilton Ticats. Their offensive line couldn't protect anybody. I mean, Zach Collaros was, had hands in his face, hands at his arm, trying to knock the ball, people at his feet the entire game. Their offensive line was abysmal. They couldn't keep the Toronto pass rush away for that entire game. Their secondary was just absolutely dreadful. Now, their secondary stunk last year, Hamilton. It was a bad secondary. It was not good at all, not good whatsoever. They brought in some reinforcements in the offseason to try to patch together a better secondary. Abdul Kanay from Ottawa was brought in, but again, he didn't play in week 1 because he was injured, not ready to go. And Emmanuel Davis, who was clearly their best cornerback last year for this Ticats team, he didn't play in week 1 either. So Toronto took advantage of that. We'll see if either of those guys are ready to return. They're just getting back to practice for this Hamilton-Saskatchewan game this week, so we'd have no indication yet whether Kanay and or Davis are going to return in that Hamilton secondary, but you're going to want to keep an eye on that because those are 2 key cogs in the Ticats secondary. You're definitely going to want to see signs that they are able to be back on the football field here for this game on Saturday night. Saskatchewan, to me, boy, 0-2, but they could easily be 2-0. Easily be 2-0. The Montreal game, again, they miss a field goal. Tyler Crapigna, and it's been a rough season for Tyler Crapigna so far. I mean, he misses the game-winning field goal against Montreal, misses a key field goal in overtime, which could have, at least given themselves a chance to get out of that game tied against Winnipeg after the overtime session. He hits the upright on that field goal attempt. So Tyler Crapigna, tough start for the Saskatchewan Roughriders for him in the kicking game. Kevin Glenn played better last week. I was impressed with Kevin Glenn. He didn't play well in week 1. The defense played well. He played well against Winnipeg last week, and the defense around him caved in. So 1 week the offense was good, 1 week it wasn't. 1 week the defense was good, 1 week it wasn't. So there's not been that consistency in both games so far on both sides of the football for Saskatchewan, hence why they're 0-2. To start the season. But again, they could easily have beaten Winnipeg at home in their first game at their brand new stadium. They could have easily beaten Montreal in that first game, but they couldn't. They didn't make the plays when they could. And Chris Jones, he's got to start doing something and showing me that he's this defensive guru everybody says he is. That was a horrendous performance last week against the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in the secondary. I've never seen so many blown coverages in one half than I saw in the second half against that Winnipeg team. It was ridiculous that Chris Jones, a guy that is supposed to make his bread on the defensive side of the football, have that team so poor on that end of the field for that entire game. Saskatchewan going to have to shore that up. I sure as hell don't trust Hamilton, even coming off the bye, going into Saskatchewan. They've had a tough time over the years against Saskatchewan, but at the same time, Saskatchewan as a favorite, laying any points right now, when they found ways to lose games both times in the first 2 weeks, that's a little bit of a leap of faith. So I'm going to have to think about this one a bit more. As of right now, it's a tough game for me. It should be an interesting one, though, because you've got two teams that haven't won a game yet this year, and they'll be looking to get on in the win column here to begin their season and get it going in the right direction. All right, it is time for best bets to wrap up the show. Andrew provided us with a best bet for week 3. Even though he's not on the show today, he is going with the Calgary Winnipeg over at 56. That's Calgary Winnipeg over the total 56. Best bet from Andrew McInnes for week 3 here in the CFL. And I agree with that. I actually think it's going to be a higher scoring game. Winnipeg's offense looked good. I think their defense is not as good. They give up yards, they give up touchdowns, they give up big plays. The reason why their defense, Winnipeg, was so good last year, forced a ton of turnovers. They're not going to be able to force anywhere near that same amount of turnovers here in 2017. So I do think we get points there. I'm going to stick with the team that cashed me a best bet winner here on the 3-down breakdown. I took BC plus the points. They were a slim underdog against Toronto. They got the job done 28-15, a best bet winner for me here on the 3-down breakdown show last week. And I'm going to stick with BC one more time. I think that Jonathan Mincy injury in the secondary for Montreal is huge. BC, a cheap price. They're the better team over Montreal. They've actually played pretty well over the years in Montreal as well. Can lay 2.5 at -115 right now at bookmaker/Chris. That's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to take BC for a second straight week as my best bet in the CFL on the 3-down breakdown. Let's take BC -2.5, -115 against Montreal on Thursday night, July 6th. That'll be my week 3 CFL 3-down breakdown best bet. All right. That is going to do it for our 3-down breakdown for this week. I'm Ian Cameron for Sportsbook Review. Stay tuned. Right side of campus, Jeff Nadeau, BMOC, and Donnie Rightside coming right up. Enjoy week 3 of the CFL season, and best of luck to all our viewers.